Qualichem, supporting the water treatment community since 1990. Qualichem offers some of the best formulation expertise in the industry. Qualichem offers a wide array of house formulations, or Qualichem can help you with your own formulations. At Qualichem, we never sell direct to the end user, so you'll never have to worry about competing with your blender. To find out more about Qualichem, go to scalinguph2o.com/Qualichem. Once again, that's scalinguph2o.com/Qualichem. At Qualichem, we know the blender matters. Accelerate your success. Why go it alone when you can get further faster and have more fun doing it? The Rising Tide Mastermind offers a dynamic environment where you can grow professionally and personally while enjoying the journey. To find out more about the Rising Tide Mastermind, go to scalinguph2o.com/mastermind. Once again, that's scalinguph2o.com/mastermind. Find out if the Rising Tide Mastermind is right for you. Welcome to the Scaling Up H2O podcast, the podcast where we scale up on knowledge so we don't scale up our systems. I'm Trace Blackmore, the host of this amazing podcast, the host of this award-winning podcast, the host of this podcast that has over 20,000 members of the Scaling Up Nation. That is just incredible to think about, and I am just so humbled by that. I am also very excited that people enjoy this podcast because I enjoy bringing it to you. So, Nation, thank you for being a member of this podcast. And we would not have gotten to numbers like that without dedicated subscribers and listeners like yourself, because you let other people know that there is a podcast out there. We have an amazing share rate statistic on how many of our episodes are listened to and then shared, and then that new person listens to the episode. There actually is such a thing as a podcast conference, and I try to go to the podcast conference, and when I do, I share some statistics with some other podcasters, and they always think I'm lying when I show our sharing numbers, because that's just unheard of in podcasting. Well, it's not unheard of if you're a member of the Scaling Up Nation and you're a member of the industrial water community, because we take that seriously. We take raising the bar in the industrial water treatment industry very seriously. And of course, that's what we try to do together each and every week. Now, today is a very special day. It is March 14th. And if you're not a mathematician, it is Pi Day. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Pi Day. And what do you do on Pi Day? Well, you celebrate pie, of course. And you do that by eating a slice of pie. Now, why is Pi Day March 14th? Well, because pi is 3.14. Now, my abilities can only take it to 5 digits. See if I can do it. 3.14159. That's as far as I can go. I have never really calculated pi when I was using that in a formula past 3.14, but I know people that can recite that to like 20 digits past the decimal point. I am not among those people. So pi is one of the most well-known mathematical constants out there. And of course, it's the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. And pi has actually been calculated to 50 trillion digits past the decimal point, and not one of those digits repeated. There's no pattern at all with pi. I find that fascinating, but not fascinating enough to learn it past 5 digits. So, Nation, go out there, have a slice of pie, and celebrate Pi Day. Nation, just a few short weeks ago, I was in San Diego, California with the Association of Water Technologies at their technical training seminars. And I got to meet so many of you out there in the Scaling Up Nation. I have to say, one of my favorite things to do is when I'm speaking, and I get the opportunity to do that not quite a half a dozen times with all the different things that I am presenting. But I will ask the question, how many people are here because they heard about it on the Scaling Up H2O podcast? And almost 75% of the room raises their hand. I'm always very humbled with that. And I'm also grateful that you are out there trying to go to events that allow you to expand your knowledge, that allow you to meet more people, that allow you to do something beyond what you're doing today and tomorrow and the next day. And one of the best ways to do that is when we talk about events here on the podcast, is you think about what are some of those events that I can add in my calendar so I can raise my own bar in this industry. And so many people, when I ask that question, they say that they're here because they heard about it on the podcast. Now, we normally mention 2 to 3 events every week just so you know what's going on, but there are dozens of events each and every week. We just don't have time to talk about all of them. So it's my hope you already know what I'm going to say because you've already done it. You have gone to scalinguph2o.com/events. That, of course, is our events page, and everything that we know about in the water industry as far as conferences and training seminars, they are on that website. It is the one-stop shop place for you to go to learn what is in the water industry, what's going on as far as all the different things that you could and maybe should attend. So if you haven't done that, or maybe you haven't done that lately, please go on scalinguph2o.com/events and figure out where are you going to go this year. Maybe there's something that's right in your backyard. You don't even have to travel to it, but you didn't know about it. And then you learn a piece of information there that changes that issue that you just couldn't solve. Or maybe you meet somebody that becomes a lifelong friend that's in this industry. I will tell you, I have several lifelong friends because I've gone to conferences. Now, I didn't have the benefit of this podcast when I started out, but I did have the benefit of my colleagues saying, Trace, you need to go to this. And many would say, you can't afford not to go to this. And I'm sure glad that I listened to them because I have met friends that I would have never had the opportunity to meet if it wasn't for that particular conference or event. James McDonald is a great example of that. And I can't imagine my life without my friend James McDonald. Of course, James supplies so much knowledge to this podcast for the Scaling Up Nation, and we are so appreciative of him. But that just goes to show you never know who you're going to meet, what you're going to learn. So go to scalinguph2o.com/events and figure out where you're going to go next. Now, I did mention that I was just at San Diego at the AWT Technical Training Seminars. Hopefully, I saw you there, but if I didn't, you have one more opportunity, and that's coming up March 26th through March 29th in Frisco, Texas. And I love Frisco, Texas. There's so many great things there, and I am going to be there. So hopefully, I will see you there, and we will have all that information on that events page that I mentioned. And maybe you are somebody that went to San Diego and you're thinking, I did that. I went there. I got the t-shirt. They don't have t-shirts. We need t-shirts. Anyway, you saw that there are so many concurrent programs going on. You can't see them all. And even if you go to the same one you went to last time, I promise you will get more out of the second time than you did the first time. So you might want to consider going back. Again, we'll have all that information for you on scalinguph2o.com/events. While you're there, you can also check out the Association for Professionals in Infectious Control and Epidemiology. They're having their annual conference in Phoenix, Arizona, June 16th through 18th. And we're going to have all of that information on our events page. And one of my favorite events of the year is the Global 6K for Water. We've been celebrating this for the past few years, and we actually create a team for the Scaling Up Nation. And we encourage you to form a team with your own company, but maybe you don't want to do that, or maybe you just want to do it on your own. Well, you don't have to be on your own. You can join Team Scaling Up. This event is put on by World Vision. It's called the Global 6K for Water. It's taking place May 17th. It's always on a Saturday. And Nation, you don't have to go anywhere for this. You can do this wherever you want to complete a 6-kilometer walk, jog, run, crawl, whatever you want to make it. You go 6K. And why 6K? Because 6 kilometers is the average distance people that don't have access to clean drinking water have to travel to go get non-clean drinking water. And what this does, this acknowledges that, and it benefits where World Vision will go into these communities and set up a local source for clean drinking water. Nation, think if you had to walk 6 kilometers for your drinking water. We are so fortunate that we can just turn on a faucet and there it is. Well, if it wasn't, and we had to schedule our entire day around water, because if we don't have water, really nothing else matters, that changes so much. Now we don't have access to education and all of the things that can happen along the trail where we're going to get water. Bad things can occur there. So just by bringing clean, fresh drinking water to those communities, people are able to go to school. People are able to stay safe. And the list goes on with all of the amazing things that happen when World Vision goes in and helps these communities. So we're going to have information on this on our show notes page. We're going to have this on our events page. And you can also go to scalinguph2o.com/6K to go directly to the World Vision website. It will take you to the Scaling Up H2O team page, but you can navigate all around there. And I encourage you to do that because this is an impressive organization that does so much to try to end the global water crisis. And I hope you mark your calendars for May 17th, and you can do that wherever you wish. We like to do something with our team. We all gather to one of our favorite parks here in Georgia, and we do a 6K, and we're all wearing our orange shirts, and we normally have great conversations with people that are also walking in that park, and they had no idea the things that I just shared with you. And normally they go back and they do something about it. So we have that ripple effect. And yes, the pun was intended. So go ahead and check that out. You will be glad that you did. And it's a fun way to do a great thing. The last event that I will mention is the 5th annual Oilfield Water Markets Conference, taking place May 6th through 7th in Irvine, Texas. We're going to have all of that information for you. Of course, you know where it is on our events page on Scaling Up H2O. Well, Nation, as I just mentioned earlier, one of my good friends that I met through the Association of Water Technologies at one of their conferences, and we were both chairing committees at the same time. Of course, I'm talking about James McDonald. That's where we met, and we became great friends. And James, way before I started this podcast, had a community on LinkedIn and did so much trying to raise the bar in the industrial water treatment industry. And of course, we hear James each and every week where he tries to raise that bar on the Scaling Up H2O podcast. So we're going to ask James, what do you know?
Hello and welcome to What Do You Know? The game show where we find out what do you know about industrial water treatment, drop by drop. So pump up your brain, take out that test kit of knowledge, and prepare to answer this week's question on What Do You Know? Today's question is, what is the molar mass of calcium carbonate? It is 100 grams per mole. We get this by adding the atomic weight of calcium, which is 40, carbon, which is 12, and 3 oxygen atoms, which is 16 each, or 48 combined. Adding all these together gives the sum of 100 grams per mole for calcium carbonate. I'm James McDonald, and thanks for playing along with us. Stay tuned for next week's episode of What Do You Know?
Thank you, James. And Nation, if you want to catch up on What Do You Know, go to scalinguph2o.com and you'll see that we have all of those on our show notes page so you can catch up at any time. And many of you are playing along as we are posting on our social media. We do most of our posting on LinkedIn. And you are getting the question and you are prepared and ready to answer when the show airs on Friday. So several people have reached out and thanked us for doing that. And by the way, if you're not connected with us on social media, go ahead and try to connect with us on LinkedIn. You'll be glad you did. We try to share some extra content with you on LinkedIn. We also have a newsletter. So if you want to sign up for that, you can go to scalinguph2o.com and go ahead and sign up for that newsletter, and you'll know some extra information about each and every episode that airs. That's just one way we're trying to say thank you to the Scaling Up Nation, because we would not be where we are today without you. Now, speaking of that, we had a member of the Scaling Up Nation reach out to us and say, I don't think you have ever spoke about this topic. I want to help with that. Well, Nation, that's how we began this interview. My lab partner today is Ryan Reimer of HydroTrue. Ryan, welcome to the Scaling Up H2O podcast.
Thank you, Trace. Pleasure to be here and looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, and I want to thank you because I tell people all the time on this show, if you got an idea, don't keep that to yourself. Let us know what it is. And you did that very thing. You reached out to me, I think via LinkedIn, and you say, hey, I've got a show idea, and here we are.
Exactly. And it was one that, probably doesn't get talked about a lot. And I'm like, I hope this isn't one that I missed listening to. So I'm glad it's a relevant topic and we're here to talk about it.
I can guarantee you this topic has never been on the Scaling Up H2O podcast.
I totally believe that because humidifiers seem to be the piece that are neglected in a facility, and they're the last piece of mind until, something goes wrong and you don't have humidity control in your environment.
Well, before we get to that, do you mind telling the Scaling Up Nation a bit about yourself?
Yeah, no problem. So my name is Ryan Reimer. I'm a man of many traits. I have had several different roles in the capacity of water treatment, starting my career out in technical sales, moving more to application engineer, and then moving towards capital project application engineering. Took a step away from a traditional water treatment company and moved into product management for humidification, a humidity control company called Dry Steam. And then from there, put out a position for a new business idea and spin off a brand called HydroTrue. So that's kind of what I've been doing on a professional level for the last, 8 months or so. So that's been a very challenging and exciting thing to do. From a personal standpoint, born and raised in Minnesota here, and maybe you can hear it through how I speak. Definitely, I've been told before that it does sound like a Minnesota accent. I'll try not to say "don't you know" a whole bunch and things like that. But went to college up in Duluth, went to University of Minnesota Duluth and got a chemical engineering degree. Live here with my family of 5 in a western suburb. So that's me in a nutshell.
Well, I have to ask, what are like the top 5 Minnesotan colloquialisms?
Oh, well, don't you know? You betcha. Oh, I'm trying to think what else. 5 is a hard one to come up with. I think those are the ones that typically come out of my mouth.
There we go. That'll work.
Yeah, and my wife always gives me a hard time because she's originally from Philly. So she always is like, why do you say those things? Why do you say hot dish or duck, duck, gray duck or things like that? And I'm just like, it's just what it is.
Now, I visited a friend up in your area, and he took me for lunch, and we had something called a Juicy Lucy. What is that?
Oh my gosh, so good. And it's such a competition point here in the Twin Cities area. A Juicy Lucy is just a burger stuffed with cheese on the inside of the patty. So it's just cheese that's surrounded by burger, and it creates a nice liquid cheese in the middle. And there's, Matt's Bar is one, the 5-8 Club is another that, are competing and trying to say, oh, we're the first, but they're all over the place at this point.
I will say it was good once I got over the third-degree burns in my mouth from biting into molten hot cheese.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things that they warn you about in the beginning. If they're like, have you been here before? Have you had a Juicy Lucy? And then they usually tell you, be careful.
It's an accurate warning. Somebody from Atlanta, we need instructions on a culinary surprise. How did you get into the water treatment industry?
Well, I kind of fell into it. I'll be honest. Right out of college, I applied a few different places, didn't quite know what I wanted to do. I was very sure going into college what I wanted to do, which was chemical engineering. And looking back, I might have told myself something different in hindsight. However, one of the people that came in to University of Minnesota Duluth was a gentleman named Travis Hansen. He's in the water treatment industry and the head of chemical engineering. Brought him in and he gave a little synopsis of what he does as a water treater. And I thought, hey, that sounds like something I would be interested in. And that was one of the places I applied, got into the program, went through a training period, and got my own territory out in Columbus, Ohio area.
What does your day-to-day look like?
My day-to-day now, actually, is probably true for my entire career. It always seems like it's all over the place, which is something that I love. I definitely have to say I'm on my toes. I'm not sure what the day is going to look like. I might have one plan, but turn into something different depending on what calls come in. But a typical day to day, now as I'm starting this HydroTrue brand and as we started this a few months ago, is first, obviously making sure all the sales activities are up to speed, but also getting things, processes in place, getting vendors in place, building out that network and that connection in this territory, being the hub for myself, and working on that sales and marketing thing. So things like this podcast is one of the things that I look for in what I do on the day to day.
All right, let's get to the main point of our interview. And of course, we're talking about humidification. And there's two terms that come up that I'm hoping that you can define and expand on, and that's adiabatic and also isothermal. What the heck are those words?
Definitely. There's some very technical words to describe how the water gets in the air. We'll start with a little bit of a history lesson. The most traditional sense of humidification is boiling water. And that would be the isothermal side of things, where we're adding a heat source directly to a water supply and having that heat transfer occur and evaporation take place. The things that I think back to my childhood is in the past, we used to have, little boiling tanks of water for humidifiers in our homes. Those are done on a grander scale for commercial and industrial applications. But then over time, that can be very cost sensitive and expensive to heat water. It's got a high specific heat capacity. And so to do that, just like in steam boilers, it takes a lot of energy. And so things like adiabatic humidifiers have really come to the forefront in the past few years through decarbonization, electrification, and things like that. But what that term means is using the energy already in the air to evaporate the water. It's really an air and water interface is where that heat exchange occurs. The common, misconception across both of these is we hear adiabatic as free cooling, right? So it makes you think it's less energy intensive. But the true matter of fact of total energy is they're the same across the board. It's just where is your energy coming from? So isothermal, again, to recap that, is boiling the water with a heat source directly. And adiabatic is taking that energy from the air existing already.
So when it comes to adiabatic, can somebody with a cooling tower just spray mist across the tower fill and presto, they've got an adiabatic cooling system?
If the envelope of the building was outside by the cooling tower fill, yes, that would work. Really what we're doing, and probably the easiest thing to think about for water treaters, at least when I came into the humidification industry, is an adiabatic type of humidifier called a wetted media system that goes in the airstream in the plenum or duct. That is, a fill type material that water trickles over the top and air blows across it, and then humidification and evaporation take place.
So the term air washer comes to mind. How are they similar? Or are they at all?
They're very similar. So the overall principle and how they work is true, right? You have water washing down some sort of material and you have air going across it. Things in an air washer obviously are being stripped out, but the intent of, like a wetted media system would be to evaporate water. And yes, it would scrub the air just by natural occurrence, just like other things that water treaters see, even though it can do it. Is that what it was intended for is really the question. But from a componentry perspective, it's relatively the same.
When it comes to an efficiency standpoint, how much extra cooling or how much extra efficiency are we getting by using adiabatic?
That's a great question. And that's one of the things that, the parent company that started HydroTrue is called Dry Steam. Dry Steam is a humidity control company. And they have three traditional products that do that. One of the things that we have for rules of thumb is like 93% less energy because of it already being in the air or applying to that humidifier directly. So that would be like an ultrasonic humidifier. Those are things that you could potentially see in your house. That's kind of a mainstream modular type humidifier that's both in residential and in commercial and industrial applications. The other good rule of thumb is for every 12 pounds of humidification that occurs adiabatically, you save 1,000 BTUs. So it's really a game of how much energy do we have available? How big of a system is it? Does it make sense to go adiabatic? And then, things like air changes, there's a whole bunch of application things. But as we look at energy, energy is really the focal point of, do I have excess energy? Can I benefit from free cooling? Because with adiabatic, you get cooling no matter what. And you could get 10 to 15 degrees in your airstream of cooling, upwards of 30 if we're doing, maybe some exhaust air and, having thermal recovery wheels and things like that.
What type of industries might we see systems like this on?
So they're kind of hiding everywhere. One of the biggest industries and regulation, just like in water treatment directly, is making a big play for a lot of things. So like healthcare, in surgical rooms, that's a place where it's required by code that the air is maintained to certain conditions, and humidification is typically employed even down in Florida, where we traditionally think of, okay, Southwest is very humid, but we're conditioning that air in those types of spaces and need to add humidity back to it, essentially because of the mechanical cooling. Other things that are, in my opinion, a little bit more fun than, the healthcare education or that comfort type cooling is critical applications where you might get benefits twofold. So like data centers are a booming industry and a macro trend right now. And they obviously want to prevent static electricity discharge, and they have benefits from free cooling. We could talk about art museums that are trying to preserve materials and keep the things like the Mona Lisas, right, safe from degradation over time from the environment. So anything that really could affect, the comfort level of an environment, if it's process related or if there's a preservation need.
I imagine if heavy mineral content water is going into these devices, that could cause a problem. So, what type of water is recommended to being used for this humidification?
So typically, one of the things I see from a water treatment perspective is most people think, okay, how can I treat for scale conditions in a steam boiler and can I apply that to humidifier? Typically, it depends on the application. So if there's anything volatile in the chemistry, that could end up in the airstream, either from an occupancy perspective or preservation perspective might be an issue. So one of the things that we look at is pre-treatment, and that's mainly equipment. So a lot of these steam generators, whether it's adiabatic or isothermal, are made out of stainless steel through all the brands, right? So we're not talking about cast iron. We're not talking about copper heat exchangers typically. So we don't really have to worry about corrosion as much, but scale is really the biggest thing. So the simplest thing is a softener system. That's probably like the good, better, best approach would be maintain your cycles of concentration on an isothermal to make sure we don't go above solubility levels. A softener will increase our cycles of concentration maximum that we can achieve. And when it does scale, that sodium carbonate scale, as we all know, is a little bit more powdery, not that hard, sticky scale that will really stick to the heat exchanger and cause issues. The third thing, the best approach would be use an RO system, reverse osmosis. to remove all TDS, at least to remove it to 98, 99% removal. And if it's ultimately critical, DI could also be employed there. Those are really the best ways to manage scale in your humidifier. The one thing that no one likes doing at the end of a season is cleaning a humidifier. So if there is scale on the back end, if we didn't preemptively manage that, cleaning that after the season is something that can be done as well.
Is there an efficiency gain benefit by going to high purity water?
Definitely. So one of the things that we look at for critical applications where they need 100% uptime, 24/7 operation, there's a few things that we look at. One of the things going back to the drain cycles is mini drain, right? So what we call mini drain, it's like a continuous blowdown on a boiler, right? We're maintaining the conductivity level in that humidifier. The other thing regarding the DI system is we need to drain less frequently just inherently by not having as many solids in the water. And so we don't have to go through drain cycles, whether those are small mini drains or complete draining of the tank. So it just allows for ultimate uptime. One of the things, though, I want to mention that I think is important as we talk about DI water and RO water is when people think we're sending that to humidifier, sometimes they think, okay, this thing doesn't need a drain ever. But one of the things that, in our experience is maintaining those RO and DI systems, things can happen. And they may not be performing like they were right in the beginning, or change out of, DI bottles might not have occurred. So we're sending solid, dissolved solid laden water downstream to the humidifier and causing some of those problems.
So if you're a carpenter, you see every problem as a nail. As a water treater, you see every problem with how am I going to treat this system? So how do you treat a system like this?
Yeah, so it really comes down to first understanding what's in the water to begin with. So as we know, sites even miles, a few miles apart could have completely different water characteristics coming to them. And without knowing that in the first place, it's kind of hard to develop a plan. One place could be getting, aquifer water, one could be getting surface water, and the characteristics are completely different. So step number one is understand what's in the water. Go through testing, determine what's the maximum, conductivity I can have in this water before scale occurs. And one of the other things that's not, at least wasn't on my radar as a direct technical representative in the water treatment industry was chlorides. I talk about we don't have cast iron in, isothermal or adiabatic systems, but we have stainless. And even though we're at, atmospheric pressure, crack corrosion is something that we see commonly with a humidifier. Minimizing not only the scale forming piece of that, but also the chloride corrosion in isothermal generators in particular, since we're cycling up. One of the other things that kind of relates to more the adiabatic side, although we know that from a hygiene perspective, there's no such thing as absolutely safe, no risk of biological growth just based on how things operate. On adiabatic systems, we need to manage the hygiene level. Do we have bacteria growth? So looking at, okay, what do we have in our system? Does this sit stagnant? Can we do flushes for inactivity or like a hygiene flush? Can we feed hydrogen peroxide to this? Because we have, again, stainless materials. We don't want to use oxidizers. And the third kind of approach is the UV treatment, right? It's a very passive. It can treat before it goes to the humidifier. It treats what it sees. So if there's any solids left in the water, it's not as effective. But when we're typically talking about adiabatic, whether that's a high pressure mister that we see maybe when we're down in Arizona at the resorts where they're out on the hospitality patios, or ultrasonic, where that's typically seen in laboratories and maybe in the duct or in the air handler space, is they're getting RO or DI water to begin with. So we don't really have solids to worry about. The fourth kind of trick in our bag, so to speak, is silver ionization, where we can leach silver ions into the water. I will have to say that, with an asterisk, there's some applications, just like hydrogen peroxide, where there's maximum thresholds acceptable. So knowing that application and saying, can I use silver? Like Semiconductor would be a no, right? That comes to my mind. We can't use silver there. Is it being sprayed directly into space that doesn't have air changes? Maybe we can't use hydrogen peroxide at the level we want to, things like that.
Before we dive deeper into our interview, we're going to take a quick break to hear from one of our sponsors. Corrosion coupons, your first line of defense. Prevent unexpected failures and extend the life of your heat transfer equipment with our corrosion coupon analysis. Don't just send your corrosion coupons to any lab. Send your corrosion coupons to a lab that understands your water treatment needs. B Labs is run by water treaters for water treaters. At B Labs, every corrosion coupon report includes a picture of your corrosion coupon before and after cleaning, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. To find out more, go to scalinguph2o.com/B Labs and up your corrosion coupon game. Once again, that's scalinguph2o.com/BELABS. B Labs, corrosion coupon reports done right. And now, back to our interview. Now, whenever we talk about tiny water droplets going into the air, Legionella pops in my head. So is there an increased risk when you're using a system like this? And if so, how do you make sure that you're doing everything that you need to?
That's a great question, and I'm glad it pops into your mind because it should pop into everyone's mind as we think about aerosols essentially in the space. So let me talk about hospitals first, because I think that's probably the application that's the most sensitive to hospital-acquired infections, HAIs, and just overall hygiene. So ASHRAE a few years ago amended one of their standards. It's ASHRAE Standard 170. And what they did a few years ago, actually it's probably more than a few years ago, it's probably about 7 years ago now, they introduced the acceptance of one technology that's an adiabatic technology for healthcare applications. And that is high pressure atomization. So there's a few things that specifically calls out. So high pressure, when we have higher pressure water, the droplets are smaller, right? We're causing that stress in these nozzles, that shear force to make smaller water droplets with just more force. So smaller water droplets, what that means is more surface area to volume. It's going to evaporate more readily. The second thing that's in there is talking about it being in an air handler. So we're not directly exposing that aerosol piece to where a patient might be or where the staff might be in that facility. RO DI water is a must as well, just because of the overall hygiene, right? We're not going to have dust collection in our air handler from dissolved solids plating out onto the drain side. And then constant recirculation is another piece in there that talks about any water that is not fully drained. We want to keep it moving. As we all know as water treaters, stagnant water is usually not our best friend as it relates to dead legs, things like that. Last but not least, we talk about that aerosol. The thing that is required in an air handler is a mist eliminator. So we want to make sure that any liquid water that's still in the airstream is taken out and only evaporated water at that point, which would be the same as regular, isothermal steam once it's evaporated, takes place. So hopefully that answers it kind of for the healthcare side of things. On other systems that, aren't to that level of criticality on hygiene, some of the normal things that happen even in those ASHRAE 170 conditions, at least with dry steam equipment, is inactivity flushes. So a very typical time frame is every 72 hours. If there's no demand, we're going to flush each zone and we're going to flush the pump station, which will then in turn cause a demand on the RO system, which will then flush. One of the other things that HydroTrue has available with their RO systems is the RO also has that inactivity flush standard. So it's user defined. You could put it every 12 hours. You could do 72 hours, things like that. Some of the other things that are considered for the adiabatic, again, I mentioned hydrogen peroxide. I mentioned UV treatment. I mentioned keeping the water moving, silver ionization. Those are all other things for Legionella. And then not only, that is testing, right? How do you know you have a problem if you don't test? So one of the things that we do on these types of systems, since there's very little interferences and they're usually in critical applications, we've been using a system from Micrometer called BactiQuant. It's a traced fluorescent reactivity for hygiene, and it has a direct correlation back to like the dip slide method or incubation type biotesting. And there's correlations to look at. So understanding what's in the system, first you have to test, you have to have good design to begin with, and then lastly, either continuous treatment or treatment if a system does become fouled.
Ryan, are there any standards that tell us what to do around hygiene?
Yeah, outside of the ASHRAE kind of general guidance, one of the things that we look to and that the industry looks to for humidification is a standard called VDI 6022. And what that is a German standard. It's readily known in the European area, but also in the United States as it relates to the air quality and the hygiene. So a lot of things we just talked about for adiabatic are part of that system, but it kind of lays out things, and there's a certification process that companies can go through that essentially say, okay, are you using acceptable materials? We haven't talked about that yet. Like stainless steel materials are non-porous, as we all know. Are you treating to RO water? Are you treating this way and that way? What's your system design look like? Do you have mist eliminators so you're not creating that aerosol? Things like that, from all the way from your high pressure pump station through your mist eliminator is kind of the scope. I know the audience can't see me as I'm using my hands to talk, but that's the general layout of what VDI 6022 covers. And it's really focused in on hygiene and it's focused in on adiabatic, but it does not exclude isothermal generators since that is still a potential risk point.
Ryan, when it comes to critical applications, what considerations need to be met? And specifically, where are we going to see these critical applications?
One of the things that we talk about with critical application is having uptime. So one of the things that causes downtime is draining and quenching that boil. So one of the things we want to do is looking at the water treatment upstream and making sure that we take care of it there so that the generator can be on as much as it physically can. One of the things with air changes per hour that we run into, and it can really be solved on the design side. It really doesn't, once we're in operation, it's kind of challenging, is selecting a technology that can be responsive. So there's different isothermal technologies, gas to steam humidifiers. There's, resistive elements that we're used to probably in CIP systems is what we're typically used to resistive elements in. And then there's a thing called electrode humidifier. The electrode is using the conductivity in the water to essentially agitate and excite the water to boil. And the problem with that, and why I bring it up, is it's great for comfort applications, but it takes a long time to get that energy to get it to boil. So that'd be a case in design where we'd be like, maybe that technology isn't the best. But it'd be great for like a yoga studio or, an office building, things like that. So first selecting the humidifier that can have that responsiveness. For example, an RTS could have an SSR control where it's 0 to 100% and it can be plus or minus 1% on the RH. On the flip side, on the adiabatic side, maybe high pressure or ultrasonic technologies would be a place there. As we talk about beyond design, the last thing I want to mention, because it's always part of that commissioning step, is working with a controls contractor to understand what their control sequences on heat and the cooling side are, so we're not fighting each other as it relates to, okay, we need to increase the temperature, for example, and that means we need to increase our humidity, and having those work together and in tandem versus fighting each other where one's coming down and the other one's going up and we're not ever meeting condition.
You mentioned cleaning earlier in the interview. How do you clean systems like this?
Great question. So we'll start on the isothermal side. One of the biggest things that we notice is scale buildup. I've joked in the past where we've seen some units so scaled because of neglect on either on the pre-treatment or an operation choice that happened, that it looks like a sandcastle in there when you open up the tank and there's so much solids left behind. So number one, getting the bulk majority out physically is something that's done. But then chemically doing it with a sulfamic acid and citric acid in particular is the choice that we have at Dry Steam and at HydroTrue. What we've noticed when people veer outside of, the manufacturer recommendations, like a hydrochloric acid could eat the stainless, not when it's just stainless, but after it's reacted with the calcium carbonate in particular, as one of those things that, people just don't think about. You look at chemical compatibility, but you have to look at it after it's reacted. So we've seen some tanks in some pretty bad shape because of that. And again, always refer back to the manufacturer's IOMs on those things. The other thing that we see on adiabatic systems isn't usually scale, because we usually have RO or DI water, especially in high pressure atomization or ultrasonic, and even wetted media systems today. As it relates to cycles of concentration, a majority of the places are going that route. So we don't really have to worry about scale so much. Really, it's the hygiene aspect of things and going through. And if we did have a biofilm or we had some hygiene outbreak, going through and draining that system, cleaning it with, a non-oxidizing biocide, or continuously feeding like a DBNPA is something that's typically done. Yeah, that's typically the cleaning methodology. One of the things that after you're done going back to the acid cleaning, having a neutralizer component to that. Don't forget about neutralizing, just so we can go to drain and obviously not damage drain and things like that.
Do systems like this have seasonality?
Definitely. That's probably the biggest challenge, and why a majority of the systems, either from a hygiene perspective, need to be taken care of. So as we typically think about, when is it humid and when is it not humid? So wintertime right now here in Minnesota, just snowed a few inches here in the Twin Cities area, and it's very dry outside. So when we're going to heat that air, absolute moisture content is very low coming in, and we need to treat for that. In the summer, if you've ever been to Minnesota, it's very hot and humid. Probably not as bad as Atlanta, Georgia, but definitely not comfortable. And one of those things, we don't need humidification then. We need dehumidification at that point. Another thing that Dry Steam does. And systems get turned off to completely drain and clean. That's great for isothermal systems. The adiabatic are a little bit trickier in just how do we get them to drain. The tank-based ultrasonic wetted media systems have total drains. That's quite simple. High pressure atomization has a whole bunch of lines, so potentially blowing that out with compressed air and laying that up. Getting back to the water side of things, so all that pre-treatment that's sitting stagnant, one of the things that we get is, how do we handle those systems? It's great and dandy that all the, if we had a dedicated water system for this humidifier, the humidifier is taken care of. What do we do with the water treatment? So there's a couple options that we recommend, especially if you went with the HydroTrue or Dry Steam RO system, is in that pre-filter housing location on an RO system, put in a preservation cartridge that's got solid chemistry in it for sodium bisulfite to lay up the membrane system so it doesn't go biological for that seasonality piece of things. On the softener or, potentially dechlorinator, that would be a pre-treatment step to the RO, is have it backwash, not on demand, but on time. So once a week backwash, so we don't have those tanks going anaerobic, is really the best way to lay that up for the season. One of the fun points, at least in my mind, because I'm a humidification water treatment dork, is that shoulder season. So I talked about winter and summer, but in that shoulder season in the spring and fall, where we have adiabatic solutions that provide free cooling, and we have a little bit of a threshold for RH increase, relative humidity increase, we're on and off. So we want to keep those systems in auto during that time period. We want them to do their automatic flushes, because some days might be running and some days might be off, and go back and forth during that transition period.
Ryan, most people that listen to this podcast are familiar with boilers. So if we're using pressurized steam, how do we do that? What does that look like?
Yeah, so one of the things that is very common and actually way precedes isothermal generators and adiabatic systems for humidification is pressurized steam boilers. And so one of the things that has existed since that time is a dispersion methodology. And typically what that looks like is some tubes, some stainless steel tubes with some tubelets or nozzles in it, and steam just directly goes into the airspace. one of the considerations that we talk about as it relates to humidification is number one, if it is a system that's sensitive for amines or even ammonia into the airstream, consider an isothermal generator or like a steam to steam heat exchanger so we don't put that into the air, number one. But really checking the health on the condensate management of these systems. If the facility is collecting that water from condensed water coming out of the dispersion grid, that's something that we need to manage as it goes back to feed water tanks, deaerators, etc. The other thing that for water treaters' sake, know that there's options out there for more effective and efficient dispersion technologies. There's patented technologies out there that have zero condensate because it uses a heat exchange within the dispersion to lift that back up and preheat it, as well as insulated tubes. So if a facility is going through an audit for their water system, that's a place for them to gain efficiency. And as a water treater, right, our jobs are to be in there and be the expert on all the applications, which can be very challenging. But it's another place for them to save energy and save water and really manage their condensate.
Ryan, we've covered a lot of ground during this interview. If somebody wants to learn more about these systems, what advice do you have for them?
That's a great question. So as much as I've talked about dry steam, they have Humidification University on their website. It's dry steam spelled funny, of course. It's DRISTEEM.com. And, outside of that particular company, there's other companies that have those types of universities. One of the ways that humidification gets in the marketplace as well is through mechanical representatives. So reach out to the mechanical representatives in your area, or maybe you already have that relationship, and see if they have a humidification line. A lot of the humidification companies put on trainings. I know Dry Steam does it in the spring and fall. Same with their competitors. Same with their websites. They'll have different application guides. They have just general product information and case studies. There's a lot of places for case studies, and I implore you to go look at our website, which I think Trace will put up here, and go from there.
All right, Ryan. Well, you've made it all the way through the interview, which means now it's time for the lightning round. So get ready. Question number one: if you can go back in time and talk to your former self on your very first day as a water treater, what advice would you give yourself?
The advice I'd give is always have an open mind to what is in a facility. You never know what you're going to run into and what the facility's goals are and challenges are. And just be curious. I think that's what's really carried me through my career. Luckily, I had it, but I'd still go back and just say, be even more curious, because the more you learn, the more exciting it is, at least in my opinion, and hit those challenges head on.
What are the last few books that you've read?
Well, I prepped for this interview, and I'm going to just answer with the personal books that I like to read versus the professional ones, because they seem to be so intermittent and thrown out there. I'm a huge fantasy nerd. I've been reading The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. So literally Ways of Kings. Let's see. The other one was Words of Radiance. And lastly, Oathbringer. So huge dork. I get it. But that's what I've been reading.
When they make a movie about the story of your life, who do you want playing you?
Yeah, so I asked this of my wife before I came on here, because I was like really stumbling, and her answer was, you may want to say Jason Statham, but you're more like a Tom Segura, is what she said to me. And I said, well, that really hurts, but I'm glad that you think I'm so funny. My answer to that, though, is Keanu Reeves. I think Keanu's just got a good attitude. He seems like he wants to be out of the limelight, just do the right thing, and have that philanthropic attitude, which he looks nothing like me. He clearly has different interests than me, but that's who I'd like.
Can you give us your best Keanu impression?
The one I typically do, you can't see, is dodging the bullets from The Matrix. So, I can't really do that one. So
I'll just let the Scaling Up Nation know you just did it for me. It was perfection. Ryan, thank you so much for coming on the Scaling Up H2O podcast, for sharing an idea to us and making sure that we have even more content to give to the Scaling Up Nation.
And I really appreciate you taking my inquiry or my solicitation of this idea, and I'm glad we were able to do this today.
Scale Up Nation, I absolutely love that. That was not a topic that I would have ever chosen. I'm familiar with it, of course, not to the extent that Ryan is, but the fact that we have a listener, a member of the Scaling Up Nation, helping us out with content, that is what this show is all about. We are all in this together. We are all industrial water treaters. We want to make this industry better, one water treater at a time. And the best way to do that is through education. How do we improve the knowledge that we all have so we can do better work in the industry, so we can ask better questions? Nation, when you're asking questions, you're learning. And I hope that that's part of your day to day. And I hope you ask yourself, what don't I know I don't know? Now, that's difficult to think about. Because how do you absolutely know what it is that you don't know? But that question will spark a fire in you, just like it does in me. What are the things I don't know around what I'm doing on a regular basis? And how do I put myself in a position so I get to know them? That's one of the reasons that I try to attend some of the events that we talk about. That's why I try to make sure that I go to places where I am not the smartest person in the room. And for somebody like me, that is not a difficult thing to find. But I will say that I learn so much from the people that are around me. And if you are not in circles like that, I urge you to find a circle like that. Who can help build you up and who can you help build up? That is how we make our lives better. That's how we make this industry better. So I encourage you to look for ways to do that. And just like Ryan, if you have an idea for the Scaling Up H2O podcast, or maybe you have a guest you want me to interview, go to scalinguph2o.com and let us know on our show ideas page, and we'll be sure to try to add that to our programming schedule. And Nation, I get questions on what happens behind the curtain. How do we schedule things? How do we know how to edit certain things? I'm always amazed by that because I really didn't think people cared. So maybe we'll do an episode on all the things that we do on the back end so you can learn about that. If that's something you want to hear, I've gotten a couple of requests from that. I don't know if that's going to be an overly popular show. So let me know. Write in if that's something that you want me to talk about, and I will be happy to. But I want to make sure it's of good value to the Scaling Up Nation. Now, Ryan mentioned a bunch of resources during the interview. We're going to have all of those on our show notes page. We're also going to have a discussion guide on our show notes page. Now, many of you are using these already, and some of you are thinking, Trace, what are you talking about? A discussion guide. Well, I have found when I go to conferences, like I mentioned in the top of the show, people will say that they are having conversations with their team on a particular podcast. So my team and I got together and we said, how could we help facilitate those conversations? And how do we make it super easy for people to bring the content out of the podcast they just listened to and apply that in their day to day? And we came up with creating discussion guides. So if you want a free discussion guide for this episode, it has a brief summary and it has some questions that your team can go around and answer. And it really facilitates a great meeting where you're discussing part of this podcast and then how you're going to apply that in your regular routine. So that is absolutely free. Just go to scalinguph2o.com, go to this show page, and you'll be able to download that. And we've got several for many shows. And so many teams are utilizing these and having great conversations, knowing that they are getting better, that they're applying best practices, and they're having better conversations because of this with their customers. So I urge you to go to scalinguph2o.com and look at the discussion guide so you can have a conversation like that with your team. Nation, another item that I will have on that show notes page is our friends at Avapco, they have some really good training literature, and they do a really good job with explaining adiabatic cooling. So I'm going to put that link on our show notes page as well. They've got a couple of videos, and I just think they do a great job. So anytime I can send the Scaling Up Nation to a resource that our friends at Avapco have put out, I want to make sure that you know about that. And Nation, speaking of knowing, there are so many people out there that still do not know about the Scaling Up H2O podcast. So I ask that you help us with that. And the next time you were talking with one of your colleagues, bring up the Scaling Up H2O podcast. And if they know about it, hey, what a great icebreaker. That's something you can talk about. If they don't know about it, you just found a new potential member of the Scaling Up Nation. Now, you might even have to tell them what a podcast is. You might have to help them download a podcast player. And if you do that, make sure you teach them how to hit subscribe. And then those podcasts will go directly to them each and every time they drop. And most people are amazed that there are over 400 episodes of content for them to devour as they are driving from account to account. By the way, so many people I talk to that are in training for this industry say that they use episodes from this podcast to help augment their training. I love how this industry is utilizing this podcast. And I love that we are all members of the same community called the Scaling Up Nation. Well, Nation, I will have a brand new episode for you next Friday. In the meantime, have a great week, folks. There's no doubt about it. Taking the Certified Water Technologist examination is one of the most challenging tasks you'll do in your water treatment career. But I'm here to help you with the first step. And that first step is my free gift to you, and that is a free CWT prep course. That's right. If you go to scalinguph2o.com/CWT prep, you'll get a portion of the paid course where you can see the type of materials that you'll be working with if you decide to sign up for the full course. Again, this is my free gift to you to get you on the journey to getting your Certified Water Technologist designation. Go to scalinguph2o.com/CWT prep today.